What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. Today's game features 4 different decks with 4 very different commanders. First, we have Robert playing his Boros equipment deck, which is led into battle by Wyleth, Soul of Steel. This deck looks to take advantage of any and all equipment in his deck in order to swing in for lethal commander damage, while also taking advantage of Wyleth's tacked-on card drawing ability to gain card advantage over his opponents. Next, we have Alex playing his Patron of the Nezumi deck, which he finished building 5 minutes before we recorded this. His deck is looking to overrun the board with a bunch of rats, so he can then sack them to cast his giant 6/6 commander instant speed and hopefully kill some people with commander damage. Then we have Brian, aka Fog playing the partner commander pairing of Akiri, Line-Slinger and Jeska, Thrice Reborn. This deck is a strange build that's actually a hidden vehicle tribal deck. He's looking to cast vehicles in order to buff Akiri so she can then crew the vehicles and attack his opponents along with doing some other random artifact shenanigans. It's really weird stuff, but that's what we do here at Not Your Average Meta. Last but not least, we have Justin playing a Scarab God deck. This deck looks to take advantage of stealing creatures out of his opponent's graveyards, as well as utilizing his own graveyard to amass a giant undead zombie army. Now let's step into the Thunderdome and see whose deck comes out on top. Justin starts the game by drawing for turn, playing a swamp, and then passing to Robert. Robert draws for turn, then decides to play a mountain, tapping for 1 to cast Fervent Champion, immediately asserting his dominance over Justin by attacking him for 1 and passing to Alex. Alex draws for turn, looks at his hand, plays a swamp, and passes to Fog. Fog draws for turn, then he decides he's going to play a Fury Calm Storm, one of the new cards from Strixhaven, revealing a plane so it comes into play untapped, and then passes to Justin. Justin starts his turn by drawing, playing another swamp, then tapping 2 to cast a Waste Knot, and passes to Robert. Robert untaps, draws, plays a Plains, then casts a Shadow Spear, tapping 1, and then equips it to his Fervent Champion, and swings it this time at Alex for 2. Alex takes a hit, going to 38, and Robert gains 2 life off his Shadow Spear, going to 42 and passes to Alex. Alex draws for turn, plays another swamp himself, and then passes to Fog. Fog then draws for turn, and plays a Sacred Foundry, taking 2 life, going down to 38 so it comes into play untapped, and casts his commander, Akiri Line-Slinger, and then passes to Justin. Justin starts his next turn by drawing, looking at his hand, and then playing a 3rd swamp, then takes a second to think about what he's going to do next, and then he taps 2 lands to cast Shepherd of Rot, and then passes to Robert. Robert untaps for turn, draws, plays an Inspiring Vantage, which comes to play untapped, and then swings 2 at Justin, taking Justin down to 37, while he gains 2 life and goes up to 44. On his second main phase, Robert taps 3 and casts his commander Wyleth, Soul of Steel, and then passes the turn to Alex. Alex draws for turn. This time he plays a snow-covered swamp, and then decides to tap 1 and cast Scheming Symmetry, picking Fog as the other person to search the library for a card to put on top. Fog draws a card that he searched for, plays a Battlefield Forge, then taps 3 mana, and casts Raiders Carvey. Justin starts his next turn by untapping his lands, drawing for turn. Then he taps 2 swamps in order to cast Night's Whisper, drawing 2 cards and losing 2 life, casts Ghost Quarter for turn, taps 2 more lands, and casts Talisman of Dominance. He then passes the turn to Robert. Robert untaps. He draws for turn, then he plays a Spire of Industry before tapping 2 and equipping his Shadow Spear onto his commander. He then swings his commander at Alex, pinging him for 3, taking him down to 35 and 3 commander damage, while also gaining 3 life from the Shadow Spear and going up to 47. He then taps 2 more and casts Leon and Shikari before passing the turn to Alex. Alex starts his turn by untapping his lands, drawing a card, and then playing another swamp. He then taps 2 swamps and casts Nezumi Grave Robber, and explains to us how he has no cards in his graveyard in order to activate the ability. So he passes the turn to Fog. Fog draws for turn, looks at his hand, and decides that he wants to play a basic Plains, after which he taps 3, and he casts an Aethersphere Harvester, gaining 2 energy. Beginning of Justin's turn, he untaps his 4 lands, and then he draws for turn. He then taps 4, including his Talisman of Dominance, to create a blue, and taking a damage to cast his commander, the Scarab God, before passing to Robert. Robert then untaps for turn, draws a card, and then plays a Rogue's Passage as land for turn, taps 2, casts Stoneforge Mystic, and then tutors through his library for a Sword of Feast and Famine before tapping 3 and casting the Sword of Feast and Famine and equipping it to his Fervent Champion. He then swings the Fervent Champion to Justin, and he swings his commander Wyleth at Alex again, both of whom take the hit for 3. Alex goes to 32, Justin goes to 30, Robert draws off the Wyleth trigger, untaps his lands off the Feast and Famine trigger, and gains 3 life, going to 46. He then taps 5 and casts Nahiri the Lithomancer, and upticks her to create a token, and uses its ability to equip the Sword of Feast and Famine to it. Before the end of his turn, Alex taps 2 lands, targets my graveyard with his Nezumi Grave Robber, switching him Night Eyes the Desecrator, draws for turn, taps 2, casts Demonic Tutor, and then taps 2 more and casts Sign in Blood, losing 2 life and drawing 2 cards before passing to Fog. Fog untaps for turn, draws, plays a Sunhome Fortress of the Legion, taps 3, and casts a Daredevil Dragster. He then uses his Akiri to crew his Raiders Carvey, and he swings it at Robert for 4. Off his trigger, he doesn't hit a land. Robert chump blocks with a Stoneforge Mystic, so no damage goes through, and then after attacks, he passes to Justin. At the beginning of Justin's turn, he untaps his lands, and he scries one on his upkeep for the Scarab God's trigger. He looks at the top card, and he pushes it to the bottom of his deck, and then he draws for turn. He then uses his Ghost Quarter to destroy Robert's Rogue's Passage, while Robert goes and looks for a land. He Bazooka Bogs him also, just to be spiteful. He then taps 1 for blue, taking a damage off the Talisman of Dominance, along with 2 swamps, and he casts Frantic Search, drawing 2 cards, discarding 2 cards, and untapping up to 3 lands. After that, he taps 3 and he casts Cemetery Reaper, and then he passes a turn. At the beginning of Robert's turn, he untaps his land and all of his permanents. Then he goes to draw for turn. Looks at his hand. Plays a basic Plains. Then he taps 2 lands and he casts Blackblade Reforged. Then he taps 3, paying the reduced cost to equip the Blackblade Reforged to his commander Wyleth. After which he goes to combat. He swings Wyleth at me for 9, and he swings the Core Soldier token at Alex for 3. Neither of us block. He draws 2 cards off the Wyleth trigger. I take the 9 commander damage. He gains 9 life, going to 55. Alex takes the 3 damage from the token, and Robert untaps his lands. He then taps 3, and he casts Wear and Tear, targeting my Aether Sphere Harvester and Justin's Waste Knot. After which he upticks Nahiri again, creating another soldier token and equipping the Feast and Famine to it, and then he passes his turn to Alex. At the beginning of Alex's turn, he untaps 4 lands, draws a card, plays another swamp, then taps 5 to play Intimidation, and then explains to us that all of his creatures now are unblockable except for artifact creatures and black creatures. After which, he swings his Night Eyes at Nahiri for 4, dropping her down to 4 points after Robert declares no blocks. After which, he passes the turn to Fog. Fog untaps his permanents, draws for turn, looks at his hand, and decides to play basic Plains. Now contemplating what's the best decision to make right now, he looks at his lands, then decides he needs to tap 4 and cast Return to Dust, targeting Robert's Blackblade Reforged and Sword of Feast and Famine. After no responses, he taps 2, and he casts a 7 Dwarves. He then uses the 7 Dwarves and Akiri to crew his Raiders Carvey to swing 4 more damage at Nahiri. Robert chump blocks with one of his Core Soldier tokens, and no damage goes through. He then passes the turn to Justin. At the beginning of Justin's turn, he untaps his lands, and everybody takes 2 life off the Scarab God's trigger from having 2 zombies. He then has a trigger where he scries 2, and he decides to push both of them to the bottom of his library, and he draws for turn. After drawing for turn, he plays Sunken Ruin in his lane for turn, taps Talisman of Dominance for blue, taking 1 damage, and then taps 4 other lands, and he casts Narfi, Betrayer King. Before he passes his turn to Robert, Robert taps 1 and he cycles his Forgotten Cave, drawing a card. At the beginning of Robert's turn, he untaps his lands, then he decides to draw for turn. He then taps 3 and casts a Sword of Fire and Ice, after which he decides who he's going to equip it to, and in the end he decides he's going to equip it to his Fervent Champion for free. He then goes to combat. He swings the Leon and Shikari at me, and the swing says Commander Wyleth along with the equipped Fervent Champion over to Alex. For some reason he has some vendetta against Alex we can't really figure out. But I take the hit for 2 going to 24, Alex takes his hit going to 9 commander damage and 18 life, while Robert draws off the Wyleth trigger as well as gaining 3 life going up to 56. He then uses the Swords trigger and he pings his rat for 2, killing it. He then taps 3 more and he casts Danitha Compassion. After which, he upticks his Nahiri, creating another soldier token, and he equips a Sword of Fire and Ice to it, and passes. At the beginning of Alex's turn, he untaps his lands, draws for turn, then taps 3 swamps, casting Icarats, giving all of us a poison counter. He then passes the Fog. He untaps his lands, and his permanents, draws a card, plays another Plains, then taps 2, and casts a second 7 dwarves. After which he taps 3 more lands and casts a Tempered Steel, pumping up his artifacts as 6/6s. He then used bolts of 7 dwarves to crew both of his vehicles and swings both of them at Robert. After which he gets his trigger off his Raider's Carvey, revealing the top card, which is a land, so he puts a Buried Ruins into play tapped, and Robert chump blocks with one of his tokens and takes 6 damage going down to 50. He then passes his turn. Justin starts his turn by untapping all of his lands in his Talisman of Dominance. Everybody takes 3 damage off the Scarab God trigger. He then scries 3 off the second Scarab God trigger, bottoms all 3 cards, draws for turn, looks at his hand, plays a swamp for turn, and decides to do nothing to pass to Robert. At the beginning of Robert's turn, he untaps his lands, untaps his permanents, reorganizes his cards, and then draws for turn. He then taps 4 lands and he casts Halvar, God of Battle, which is immediately murder shrouded by Justin after he pays 2 life and taps 3 swamps. After Halvar dies, Robert taps 2 and equips a Sword of Fire and Ice to his commander Wyleth. He then decides to take Wyleth and swing him at me for 5 commander damage, taking me to 15 commander damage and 16 life, while he gains 5 life, draws 2 cards, and uses the Fire and Ice trigger to ping the rat Alex has. He then creates another Core Soldier token and puts in a tapped Sacred Foundry and passes the turn to Alex. At the beginning of Alex's turn, he untaps his lands, draws for turn, plays another swamp, and then passes the Fog. Fog then untaps all of his permanents, draws for turn, taps 2 lands and casts a third 7 dwarves. He then taps 2 more, sacking his Buried Ruin to return an artifact from his graveyard to his hand, and he chooses his Aether Sphere Harvester. He then taps 3, plays the Aether Sphere Harvester, and goes to combat. He taps 2 of his dwarves, equipping 2 of his vehicles, and swings the Carvey and the Daredevil Dragster at Robert. He hits a Plains off his Carvey trigger, Robert chump blocks with one of his tokens, then takes the other 6, going down to 41, and the Daredevil Dragster gets 2 counters, which is then sacrificed so he can draw 2 cards, and he passes to Justin. At the end of my turn, Justin taps 4, uses his Scarab God's ability to create a 4/4 zombie token copy of Halvar, God of Battle. Then at the beginning of his upkeep, he untaps his lands, and we all lose 4 life because he controls 4 zombies. He then scries 4 off the Scarab God's ability, and decides to bottom all 4 cards and draws for turn. He then plays a swamp and taps 2 swamps and the Talisman of Dominance to cast his Murderous Rider. After which, he passes the turn to Robert. At the beginning of Robert's turn, he untaps all of his lands, he untaps his commander, and then he draws for turn. He then thinks for a second about which lands to tap, and then at the end of the day, he decides to tap 6 lands and cast Godo, Bandit Warlord, which is immediately countered by Justin with a Sinister Sabotage. After Godo gets countered, Robert casts a Hammer Mazan and goes to equip it to his commander before it gets mobbed by Alex, sending it back to the command zone. After which he equips the Hammer Mazan, the Shadow Spear, and the Sword of Fire and Ice all to his Fervent Champion, and swings him at Justin. He adds a block with his 4/4 token along with his Murderous Rider. At the beginning of Alex's turn, he untaps his lands, draws for turn, plays an Ash Barrens, and maybe for the first time in the history of live EDH gameplay, hard casts Patron into Nezumi and passes to Fog. Fog untaps all of his permanents and all of his lands and draws for turn. He then casts his other commander, Jeska Thrice Reborn, before tapping 4 and casting Aerial Knot Admiral, giving all of his vehicles flying. He then taps 2 of his 3/7 dwarves, crewing his vehicles and swinging them both at Robert. He doesn't hit anything off the Carvey trigger, but explains to the table he's giving Aetherfield Harvester lifelink, as well as Jeska's 0 ability to have him deal triple damage to an opponent. Robert can't block, takes a 21 damage, going down to 16, while Fog gains 15 life before passing the turn to Justin. At the beginning of Justin's turn, we all take 4 life off the Scarab God trigger, and he scries 4 again. He then decides to keep a couple cards on top and bottoms a couple, and then draws for turn. He then taps 4, including his Talisman of Dominance, to create a token copy of Godo Bandit Warlord. He then taps 4 more to cast a Dread Summons for 2, hitting 1 zombie token, and then passes. At the beginning of Robert's turn, he untaps his lands, draws for turn, plays a mountain, then he casts a fancy Mana Crypt. He then taps 4 and equips his Hammer of Nazan to his Danitha. Then he taps 2 more and he equips the Sword of Fire and Ice to Danitha as well. He then goes to combat, swinging Danitha at me before he realizes she has Vigilance, so he doesn't need to tap her. I just chump block with my Aerial Knot Admiral, and then he gains 6 life, going up to 18. He then creates another core token with the Hiri and passes. At the beginning of Alex's turn, he untaps his lands, and he plays a Gaia Ridge Sanitarium. He then taps 2, making all of us draw a card and discard a card. After which, he taps another 2, and he casts Raise the Draugr, targeting his Ichor Rats and his Nezumi Grave Robber in his graveyard, returning him to hand before casting the Ichor Rats, giving us all another poison counter. At the beginning of my turn, I untap my lands and the rest of my permanents. I then draw for turn, and tap 6 to cast Ugin the Inevitable, using his downtake ability to target Nahiri and finally kill her. After which I go to combat by tapping 2 of my 7 dwarves, crewing my vehicles once again, targeting the Aetherfield Harvester with Jeska's ability, also giving it lifelink, and I swing them both at Robert. Robert deflecting palms my Aetherfield Harvester, and then chump blocks my Raiders Carvey. At the end of my turn, Justin activates Shepherd of Rot to make all of us lose 6 life, then goes to his upkeep. At the beginning of his upkeep, we all lose an additional 6 life while he scries 6. This knocks Alex out of the game, takes me to 4 life, and takes Robert to 17 life. He then puts cards back on top of his library and draws for turn. Then he casts a Training Grounds. And he taps 3 mana to make a token copy of Sidisi Undead Vizier and goes to tutor for a card from his library. After tutoring for a card, he uses 1 floating black mana and taps another 2 to make a token copy of Undead War Chief. He taps his Shepherd of Rot again, making all of us lose 7 life, knocking me out of the game and taking Robert down to 4 life. He then passes. At the beginning of Robert's turn, he untaps all of his permanents, and then goes to roll for his Mana Crypt trigger. odds hurt, and he takes 3 damage, living on the edge and going down to 1 life. He then draws for turn, looks at his hand, and just taps 2 lands to attach his Shadow Spear to Danitha. He then swings Danitha at Justin. Justin chump blocks with his Murderous Rider. Danitha gains Robert's 7 life. He goes up to 8. Then he taps 1 and he swords his Scarab God. After which he taps another 3. And he generously gifts his Shepherd of Rot, giving Justin a 3/3 elephant and then passing his turn. At the beginning of Justin's turn, he untaps all of his permanents. Then goes to draw for turn. Then taps all of his lands and he recasts his command of the Scarab God. He then passes the turn to Robert. At the beginning of Robert's turn, he untaps all of his permanents. Rolls his dice for good luck, rolls for his crypt trigger and wins. Draws for turn, and then swings Danitha at Justin again, who chump blocks with one of his 4/4 zombies. Robert then gains 7 life once more, and then taps 1 and passes to exile the Scarab God, and then passes his turn back to Justin. At the beginning of Justin's turn, he untaps all of his lands, and at this point, Robert forgot he's going to recast his commander Wyleth, so we go ahead and let him recast it because we're pretty casual around here. Justin draws for turn, taps a Talisman and 2 swamps, casts Phyrexian Arena. He then taps another swamp and he casts Grave Harvest. Now he's trying to decide what he needs to do in this situation, so he takes some time to think, and ultimately he decides the best decision to make is to start creating some zombie tokens with what he has in his graveyard. So he looks to his graveyard for what he's going to exile. Grave Harvest is a really good card if you plan on attacking, but Justin never attacks in this deck, so I don't know, maybe not the best card. He then taps and creates a zombie token by exiling Shepherd of Rot. And in an illegal next move, he decides to exile a Murderous Rider to create another token, which we then realize should have been already shuffled back into his library. Afterwards, he passes the turn to Robert. Robert untaps, rolls for his Mana Crypt trigger, wins, draws for turn, and in a long series of decision making, he ultimately decides to equip all of his equipment to his commander, but takes a very long time to decide which order he's going to do that in. So after shooting up his commander, he goes to attacks. And there's only one person to attack, so he swings Wyleth at Justin. Draws 3 off the Wyleth trigger. Justin chump blocks with one of his zombies. Robert gains 7 life. Plays a land for turn. Taps 2 and casts Pure Steel Paladin and then passes his turn. At the beginning of Justin's turn, he untaps all of his permanents. Then takes the life to draw off the Phyrexian Arena and draw for turn. He then taps 3 to cast the Never half of Never Return on Pure Steel, which Robert instant speed equips the hammer to protect it, and then Justin passes his turn to Robert. At the beginning of Robert's turn, he rolls for his Crypt trigger, losing, going down to 19. He then untaps the rest of his permanents and draws for turn. He then plays a land for turn, and then taps for 3, casting a Sword of War and Peace, which Justin counters with an Arcane Denial. After which, Robert taps 3 more and casts Ironclad Slayer, bringing the Sword of War and Peace back to his hand before once again recasting it. He then equips the sword along with the hammer to his commander Wyleth, goes to combat, and swings him at Justin. He then draws 4 cards off the Wyleth trigger. At the beginning of Justin's turn, he untaps all of his lands. And this is when Robert remembers he was supposed to be gaining 9 life from his Wyleth attack and lifelink, so he goes up to 28. Justin loses 1 life to draw off his Phyrexian Arena, then draw for turn. After which, Robert reminds him they both should be drawing off to Arcane Denial, so Justin draws an additional card, and Robert draws 2. Justin then plays for land for turn. And then for what seems like the 1000th time this game, he casts his command into the Scarab God. He then taps enough lands to make a 4/4 token copy of Zombie Master, and then passes his turn to Robert. At the beginning of Robert's turn, he untaps all of his permanents, draws for turn. Then he realizes that he needs to roll for his Mana Crypt trigger after playing his command tower, so he rolls, wins the roll. Then taps 2 to cast a Shram Senior Artificer. Then taps 4 more and casts a Batterskull. He then draws off the Shram trigger. He then equips the Batterskull to his commander and swings them at Justin. Justin chump blocks with the Elephant, his Cemetery Reaper, and a couple zombies. Robert gains 12 life going to 40. Then he taps 1 to cast a Commander Plate. Then he casts a Brass Squire. He then Valor stances Justin's Scarab God, and at that point Justin knew it's over, so he conceded the game to Robert. Today's big winner was Robert playing his Wireless Soul of Steel deck. Robert got out to a fast start and just never looked back. There's a couple times where it seemed like he had a chance of losing, but ultimately he powered through and came out on top. The MVP of today's game goes to the card Deflecting Palm, who definitely came in clutch and saved Robert from losing the game a couple turns before he ultimately won. In my opinion, Deflecting Palm is a Boros staple that should be run in every deck that utilizes the colors red and white. Thanks for watching, and be on the lookout for more games and decks that you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.